Mr. Speaker, I think several things have struck us during the course of this debate. Firstly, the sheer volume of decent people who seem to have been affected by this crisis over a period of time. The well-measured and sensible and proportionate campaign that has been organised by EMAG, which stands apart sometimes from perhaps those conducted by other pressure groups. I think we've all been struck by the political reaction, and just for the sake of the record, the Conservative Party was clear about its intentions in its manifesto. The coalition was clear about its intentions in its agreement, and the government has been swift in its action. Whatever we may say about that action, it has at least been swift in putting its commitments in place as early as it possibly could. But needless to say, there is a but, and that is, of course, that the devil remains in the detail of the payments, which, of course, are not under proper discussion tonight, and for very good reasons. Mr. Deputy Speaker, financial institutions, it seems, are no longer trusted. Young people do not know where to go. Older people do not know who to trust. And so it befalls us all to ensure that confidence is restored. And it was a moral dilemma, Mr. Deputy Speaker, for the last government, and it is a moral dilemma rather than a financial dilemma for this government too, that we resolve this as soon as we possibly can. Now, EMAG makes a series of sensible proposals. It actually points out quite rightly that a staggered system of repayments could work. It points out quite rightly that those in greatest need should be perhaps considered slightly separately from those who are not. And even Equitable Life itself has made its position quite clear as far as what it expects an absolute basic minimum to be. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Ombudsman has mentioned that the level of compensation should, I quote, reflect the state of public finances. Now, it seems to me that across this debate, a number of people have raised one eyebrow, and in some cases two, at that proposal. And I have to say, on that particular point, I think there is probably quite a lot of sympathy. Equitable Life members across Britain all recognise that there was a risk attached to whatever it was they invested all those years ago. However, they will feel, and I think quite reasonably, very unfairly penalised if we use the sort of public purse argument to bypass our moral obligations in this particular case, especially if I was to be snide for just a moment when we are quite happily talking about spending 100 million quid on an AB referendum. Those are the sort of things which put us in this House in a rather sort of difficult situation when it comes to retaining the moral high ground. So I agree absolutely entirely with the member for Mid-Norfolk, who's sadly not here now, in restating the importance of the next stages of this process. Of course
I'm grateful. I do understand the pressure for time on this. And I think on that very point, I mean, all of us here, I think are here because we signed a pledge. We stood up for a group of people in our constituency who we felt had been really let down and betrayed by the last administration. And I suppose I would urge the ministerial team to think creatively at a time of great pressure on the public finances, and in particular to consider making payments that are free of tax, or to basically have a fund that pays out over a period of time, because I think the recommendations as proposed, or at least as trailed, are simply insufficient. And we know we have some of the best minds in the country working in the Treasury. Let's get them to work on this very problem.
Well, thank you. That's a useful contribution. And I was about to really restate one of the points made by the member for Mid-Norfolk, which reinforces your intervention. The next stage is important because not just for those who've struggled over the last 10 years, not just for the families of those who may have died whilst waiting for justice, but it's also important for restoring the confidence of current and future investors who we are trying to persuade to act responsibly as far as their sort of fiscal affairs are concerned. But, and perhaps this hasn't come up much in the debate today, for the credibility of members of this House and the credibility of this Parliament. And that, I think, is perhaps where your intervention was leading. In other words, we must not and we cannot let people down now with a lame excuse, perhaps, about the state of the public finances. This goes far deeper than just the state of the public finances today. And if I can just quote, as a number of other members have, one or two of the submissions that we've had from our own constituents. And I'd like to refer to an email from Jerry Robertson of St Clair's in Carmarthen, a constituent of mine, who simply wrote this: "I'm afraid this business further undermines my confidence in politicians, and if justice isn't done on this issue, I don't see I will ever want to cast a vote in a general election ever again." That, Mr Deputy Speaker, is an important message which we need to take in isolation from all of the technical aspects of this debate. The very credibility of us, on all sides of the House, the very credibility of this government and the very credibility of this building depends on the way in which we deal with issues such as this. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Minister, I think, has made significant progress. I support this bill. I think it's been dealt with as quickly as it possibly can. I think that the suggestions from members on the other benches that somehow a delay has been imposed deliberately seems to me to be an absurd rewriting of history. I can't understand how they could possibly, in all consciousness, stand up and make observations like that, given what we all know, several thousand people and their families have been through as a consequence of an inactive decade, to say the very least. So the Minister has made progress. We should support him. I believe it is the moral obligation of all parties, of all members, to put our party political interests aside. Just for one moment, I naively and optimistically suggest to ensure that we can bring this to the fair and sensible conclusion that this bill doesn't pretend to be anything other than the first part of that process.